There is a paradox that leaves many people confused when they look back at what happened. The narcissist is the one who actively ends the new relationship, yet they themselves do not truly understand why they did so. It is not because the new person was not good enough, not quite because the excitement faded, and not entirely because there was a more appealing option elsewhere. What drives that act of discard lies much deeper at a level the narcissist is incapable of seeing, let alone naming. In Carl Jung's terms, this is not a conscious decision, but a reflex of the persona when it begins to lose its ability to shield the shadow. The narcissist does not leave because they clearly understand what is wrong. They leave because of a vague yet persistent sense that something isn't right, even though, on the surface, the relationship still appears to function normally. There is no major conflict, no obvious shock, only a subtle, uncomfortable misalignment that makes it impossible for them to settle. What must be understood from the outset is this: the narcissist is not seeking a new person in the ordinary sense. They are seeking a psychological function, a mirror that is familiar enough, compatible enough, and capable of regulating unconscious tensions they cannot manage on their own. A new supply may offer novelty, admiration, even initial idealization. But if that person's emotional responses do not align with the old structure the narcissist once relied on, instability emerges very quickly, quietly, but relentlessly. And it is precisely here that a chain of paradoxes begins to form. The narcissist feels restless without knowing why. They sense emotional distance without any reasonable explanation. They lose the feeling of familiarity, yet cannot point to anything concrete that has changed. Instead of turning inward to identify the source of this misalignment, they look outward. Instead of confronting the void opening inside them, they choose to eliminate the external element that triggers the discomfort. Discard, therefore, is not a conclusion, it is an act of avoidance. This video is not meant to judge, nor to frame the story in terms of winning or losing. Its purpose is to illuminate the psychological structure behind discard behavior. Why the narcissist abandons the new person without understanding the real reason. Why constant replacement never brings stability. And why the cycle only ends when either they confront their own shadow or someone else definitively steps out of the mirror role. When this mechanism becomes clear, many questions that once haunted you fall away on their own, not because you have found more answers, but because you are no longer standing in the wrong place to ask them. Part 1. The illusion of replacement, when the narcissist believes they have resolved it. In the early stage of a new relationship, the narcissist often inhabits a very distinctive psychological state, the false confidence of someone who believes they have escaped an old problem. They do not perceive the new supply as an independent person with an inner world of their own, but as living proof of a conclusion they have already reached internally. I'm fine now. I just needed to change the person. It is precisely this belief that creates the illusion of replacement, a fragile foundation, yet one that feels profoundly convincing to them. Within the narcissist's surface-level logic, everything appears to make sense. The new person is more admiring, more responsive, asks fewer questions, touches fewer uncomfortable areas. Their persona is fed once again, the feeling of being chosen, desired, seen as the best version of themselves. And at the conscious level, the narcissist arrives at a swift conclusion. The problem wasn't me, the problem was the former partner. But this is exactly where the distortion begins. From Carl Jung's perspective, the persona can only function stably when it is supported by a familiar unconscious system. The narcissist does not live through inner self-awareness. They live through external feedback. What they are truly seeking in the new supply, therefore, is not love, but the continuation of an old regulatory mechanism, a familiar way of being soothed, mirrored, and relieved of tensions they cannot process on their own. No matter how appealing the new supply may be, They remain a new variable within an old structure, and sooner or later, this inevitably creates friction. The danger of this stage lies in one critical fact. The narcissist genuinely believes the replacement has succeeded. This is not pretense. They feel lighter, less preoccupied with the former partner. They tell a new story with the certainty of someone who has just reset their life. But this sense of relief does not come from the problem being resolved. It comes from a symptom being temporarily anesthetized. The shadow has not disappeared. It has merely been pushed back into silence, waiting for a familiar condition to return. At this stage, things begin to drift, but they have not yet collapsed. The narcissist feels mildly bored, vaguely empty, slightly disengaged, but not clearly enough to name it. They do not say, "I am destabilized." They say, "I don't feel anything anymore." They do not experience the unease as an inner signal, but as a malfunction originating from the outside world. And because of this, instead of adjusting their perception, they continue to invest in the illusion. I just need to try a little harder, or find someone even more compatible. I'm safe. Most discards begin here not with anger or cruelty, but with a very quiet misbelief. The belief that the problem has been resolved, when in reality it has merely been relocated. Part 2. The moment of misalignment, when the new mirror no longer fits the old shadow. What makes this phase difficult to recognize is that there is no event significant enough to be named. The relationship does not collapse. There is no explosive argument, no act of betrayal that forces a decision. On the surface, everything continues to function normally, perhaps even well. Yet underneath, a very small deviation has emerged, too subtle to prove, but enough to disrupt the rhythm. This misalignment does not arise from behavior, but from response. The narcissist begins to notice, without conscious awareness, that in moments when they need deep reassurance, the new person responds in ways that are slightly offbeat, not morally wrong, not lacking goodwill, simply missing the key point. A sentence that once landed perfectly with the former partner now falls flat. A silence that once soothed now irritates. A gaze that once read them now only reflects the surface. Everything is reasonable, yet no longer compatible. Here, the tension between persona and shadow begins to strain the structure. The narcissist's persona wants everything to be smooth, tidy, and controllable. But the shadow, the repository of primitive insecurities, requires a very specific, familiar form of reassurance, one built from an old psychological history. The new person does not carry that history and therefore cannot respond intuitively. They react in the present, while the narcissist's shadow operates through unconscious memory. From Carl Jung's perspective, this is the moment when the shadow begins to call in its debt from the persona, not through violence, but through a lingering sense of wrongness. The narcissist cannot say, "I am being triggered by an unconscious lack." So they say, "I don't feel anything anymore." They cannot admit, "I need a very specific form of mirroring to remain stable." So they translate it into, "This relationship lacks spark." Conscious language always arrives after unconscious experience, and it is often misdirected. What is worth noting is this: the new person has done nothing wrong. Precisely because there is no wrongdoing, the situation becomes even harder to understand. They are present, caring, appropriately responsive, yet unable to reach the level that needs to be reached. And because the narcissist cannot distinguish between structural misfit and insufficiency, restlessness quickly turns into boredom, coldness, and emotional distance. There is no clear decision, only a gradual withdrawal, less investment, less sharing, less patience. From the narcissist's side, this is not a deliberate choice, but a self-regulatory reflex. When inner stability is not restored, the system seeks to eliminate whatever appears to trigger the discomfort, even if that element is innocent. They do not say, "I am losing equilibrium." They say, "This relationship isn't right." And within that logic, leaving feels reasonable and necessary. The moment of misalignment thus becomes a point of no return, not dramatic enough to allow healing, yet persistent enough to erode the bond. From here on, discard is no longer a possibility. It is an outcome prepared in silence, when a new mirror can no longer replace the function the old shadow once depended on in order to survive. Part 3. Unconscious tension. When the shadow begins to push back. At this stage, the shadow is no longer silent, but it does not surface in a dramatic or easily recognizable way. Instead, it appears as a background tension, a persistent sense of discomfort that the narcissist cannot explain rationally. They no longer feel held from within. The unconscious stability that once allowed them to remain in the previous relationship, no matter how toxic that relationship may have been, is gone. And the danger lies in this. The narcissist has no inner language with which to recognize this state. The narcissist's shadow is not like ordinary sadness or fear. It is a core mass of primitive insecurity, formed very early, bound to an inability to self-soothe, to feel inherently sufficient, or to exist in a neutral internal state. Under normal circumstances, this mass is regulated externally through a mirror: reactions, emotions, familiarity, an old rhythm. When that mechanism no longer functions smoothly, the shadow begins to exert pressure on the entire system. But because the narcissist cannot face it directly, that pressure is discharged outward through behavior. From here, a series of very concrete changes begins to appear. The narcissist becomes more irritable over small details. They grow impatient with responses that are, in themselves, entirely normal. They feel bothered by the presence of the new person, even though it was they who actively pulled the relationship closer in the first place. Not because the other person has changed, but because the narcissist's internal capacity to tolerate experience is deteriorating. When the shadow is no longer regulated, every stimulus becomes overwhelming. From Carl Jung's perspective, a shadow that is not integrated does not disappear. It seeks to take control. But for the narcissist, integrating the shadow is nearly impossible, because it would require acknowledging vulnerability, lack, and inner responsibility. As a result, the shadow is not recognized as part of the self, but projected onto the external environment. Inner instability is not experienced as "I am unstable," but as something outside is making me uncomfortable. At this point, the narcissist's inner questioning has completely veered off course. They do not ask, "What within me is becoming unbalanced?" because that question is too dangerous. It directly threatens an already fragile ego structure. Instead, they ask, "Why does this person make me uncomfortable? Why do I feel suffocated? Why don't I want to be here anymore?" These questions allow them to preserve their self-image, while shifting all responsibility onto the external object. In this context, discard is not a moral decision, nor is it a carefully considered long-term choice. It is a survival reflex. When the internal system is overloaded and lacks the capacity to self-regulate, the most instinctive response is to eliminate the element that triggers the tension. Not because that element is bad, but because it has become a point of contact with the shadow. Discard is like pulling the power cord from a malfunctioning device, not to repair it, but to immediately stop the discomfort. What must be emphasized is this: even when discard occurs, the narcissist's internal tension does not truly disappear. It merely shifts form. The void is no longer triggered by the presence of the new person, but it is not healed. The narcissist may feel brief relief, like closing the door to a suffocating room, but soon afterward, the emptiness returns, deeper and harder to name. And because they cannot link this feeling to the act of discard, they continue to believe that the problem lies in not having met the right person yet. At a deeper level, this is when the narcissist's control structure begins to fracture. As the shadow applies continuous pressure, The persona must expend increasing amounts of energy to maintain an appearance of stability. They grow exhausted without understanding why. They lose interest in things that once made them feel powerful. Their behavior becomes inconsistent, drawing close, then pushing away, showing care, then turning cold, wanting attachment, then wanting to disappear. This is not a conscious strategy, but the manifestation of a system struggling to maintain equilibrium at any cost. From the perspective of the person being discarded, this stage often causes the deepest injury because it lacks logic and explanation. But from the narcissist side, this is not the moment of "I choose to leave," but the moment of "I can't tolerate this anymore." Not the other person, but the internal state that the relationship activates. And because they cannot distinguish between the two, their behavior becomes cold, severing, even cruel, not out of malice, but because the unconscious has taken control. The critical point to understand here is this: the narcissist does not discard in order to end a relationship, but to cut off a current of internal tension. They do not leave with clarity. They leave in confusion. They do not feel that they are doing something wrong. They simply feel the need to get out. And precisely because discard occurs at the reflexive level rather than the conscious one, when they later look back, narcissists are often unable to explain clearly why everything ended. Most will reconstruct the story through rationalization, incompatibility, loss of feelings, wrong timing, different life goals. But these narratives are merely a linguistic layer placed over a far more difficult truth to face, that they left not because they knew what they wanted, but because they could not remain with themselves in that context. And when a person must repeatedly abandon situations in order to avoid feeling their inner state, the discard cycle never truly ends. It only repeats itself in new forms. Part 4. The Jungian Truth. Why they never understand why they discard. There is a truth that is extremely difficult to accept, not only for the narcissist, but for anyone who has never walked a deep inner path. True understanding is not the accumulation of information, but the capacity to endure the truth about oneself. And it is precisely here that every path available to the narcissist comes to an end. Not because they lack intelligence, nor because they lack experience, but because their psychological structure is not designed to remain with the truth once its protective layers are stripped away. In Carl Jung's analytical psychology, genuine understanding always comes at a cost: the temporary dissolution of the self-image. To understand why they discard, the narcissist would have to see that the behavior does not originate from an external object, but from a primitive void that has never been filled. And that void has no simple cause, no clear culprit, and no solution that can be achieved by replacing another person. It can only be recognized and endured. But this is precisely what poses the greatest threat to the narcissistic ego. The entire narcissistic self is constructed to avoid one singular moment, the moment of sitting still before one's own emptiness, without a mirror, without a role, without another person serving as background support. Facing the shadow, in this case, does not mean confronting something bad, but confronting the absence of an inner foundation, a state in which there is no sense of sufficiency, no stable sense of existence without external validation. Therefore, understanding why they discard would require admitting this truth. I did not leave because the other person was incompatible. I left because I cannot remain in a state that is not externally regulated. This truth is fundamentally incompatible with the persona the narcissist inhabits. The persona requires a narrative in which they remain the one in control, the chooser, the active agent. The shadow tells a completely different story, that they reacted rather than chose. At this intersection, the narcissistic mind performs a familiar maneuver. It closes the door to awareness, not through loud denial, but through systematic vagueness. They do not dig deeper. They do not follow the question to its end. They do not pause long enough to feel what is happening. Instead, they move emotionally, relationally, narratively. Movement becomes the most refined form of escape from genuine understanding. This explains why the cycle of new supply, misalignment, discard never produces answers. Each loop merely reinforces another illusion, that the problem lies in interpersonal incompatibility rather than in their own structure's inability to tolerate itself. And because every discard is rationalized through a new story, the narcissist increasingly believes they are moving forward, when in reality they are circling the same abyss. From this perspective, the narcissist is not someone who doesn't want to understand, but someone who cannot understand without collapsing. Understanding in this context does not lead to enlightenment, it leads to a void for which there are no internal containers. For someone accustomed to existing through reflection, losing all external anchors in a moment of deep self-awareness would feel like free fall, no ground, no direction, no role to cling to. And so the psyche chooses the familiar loop over the dangerous truth. From the outside, people often look at the narcissist and ask, why don't they ever learn the lesson? But this question assumes that the lesson can be learned without destroying the learner. In this case, the lesson does not reside in behavior, but in being. It demands a profound restructuring, something the narcissist is not equipped to undertake without severe crisis or long-term therapy accompanied by genuine willingness. Thus, they continue the cycle not because they are evil, nor because they deliberately wish to harm others, but because their system has only one way to survive. Each discard is an attempt to prevent structural collapse, even if the cost is increasingly fractured relationships. And paradoxically, the very avoidance of self-confrontation drives them further away from the capacity to understand not only others, but themselves. The Jungian truth here is not accusatory. It does not claim that the narcissist is to blame, but rather that not everyone has the capacity to stop. Stopping requires sufficient inner strength to remain in silence without disintegrating, to face emptiness without immediately filling it. When that capacity does not exist, the cycle continues, not as a moral choice, but as a structural limitation. And understanding this is not about justifying harm, but about ending the illusion that one day they will finally understand and everything will be different. Part 5. The Awakened Perspective. Discard says nothing about the worth of the new person, and it says nothing about your worth either. There is a quiet but deeply wounding psychological blow that discard leaves in the person who is left behind. The feeling of being not enough, not attractive enough, not attuned enough, not understanding enough, not valuable enough to be kept. And it is precisely this feeling that traps so many people in relentless self-dissection, as if finding one small flaw could suddenly make the entire story make sense. But this assumption is flawed at its root. Discard is not an evaluation of a person. It is not a conclusion about anyone's character, worth, or deservingness. It is a symptom of a psychological system that lacks the capacity for self-regulation and is therefore forced to eliminate whatever destabilizes it. Seen from this angle, the entire narrative shifts axis. The issue is no longer who you are, but what role you were placed in. From Carl Jung's perspective, people truly meet only when both selves can stand securely within their own inner worlds. In relationships with a narcissist, this does not occur. The other person does not come to meet you as a whole human being, but to use a function, to serve as a mirror, an emotional regulator, an anchor that prevents internal chaos. When that function falters, even if through no fault of your own, the system moves to eliminate the disruptive component. This is why the question so often asked by the discarded person, "Where did I go wrong?" is actually born from identifying with an assigned role. It assumes that the relationship operated according to the logic of healthy value exchange, when in reality, you were inside a structure where personal value was never the operating criterion. Here, your presence was measured solely by how well you continued to function as a regulator. The awakening question, therefore, is not about hunting for mistakes, but about reframing perception. Not what did I do wrong, but rather, am I being used as a function? This question is not meant to assign blame, but to return to you the ability to see your true position. When you ask it, you step out of the role of the evaluated and into the role of the observer of the structure. From that position, many pieces begin to fall into place on their own. You start to see that your efforts to be more understanding, more patient, more adaptable, never actually made the relationship safer. Because the issue was never the degree of effort, but whether you were being loved as a person or retained as a tool. When a tool no longer works, it is replaced not because it lacks value, but because the system does not know how to operate differently. What matters most at this stage of awakening is this. Do not try to rescue the old story by fixing yourself. Many people fall into the trap of self-improvement after discard with an unspoken goal. Next time I'll be better, so I won't be abandoned. But if you do not change the core question, you are only preparing to enter another functional loop with a different character, inside the same familiar structure. Awakening is not about becoming cold or closed off. It is about learning to distinguish between connection and use. When you begin to understand that discard does not reflect your worth, you also begin to reclaim the right to define yourself beyond the roles of healer, understanding one, or stabilizer. And when you no longer place yourself into those roles, many relationships will fall away on their own, not because you have become less, but because you are no longer suitable for being used. At this point, pain transforms into clarity. You no longer need to prove that you are enough. You no longer need to be kept in order to confirm your value. You need only one thing, to exist as a human being, not as a function. And any relationship that cannot survive once you step out of that role was never capable of holding you fully. Seen from an awakened perspective, discard is no longer a loss of dignity or a personal failure. It is the moment the system reveals itself. And once the system is visible, there is no longer any reason to remain inside a story that was never written for your real self. Part 6. When the new supply cannot carry a role they themselves were never told they were expected to fulfill. There is a truth that is rarely faced directly. The new supply does not fail because they are inadequate, but because they are placed into a role that even the narcissist is not consciously aware of demanding. At this stage, the issue is no longer about incompatibility, nor about lack of feeling, but about the quiet collapse of an unconscious expectation that cannot be met. The narcissist enters the new relationship with an unspoken assumption that this person will instinctively know how to keep their inner world from falling apart. Not through conscious effort, but through unconscious attunement, right timing, right reflexes, right silences. But the new supply does not have that history. They do not carry the relational memory of the past. They do not know how to respond when the narcissist falls into states of emptiness, fatigue, or unexplained irritation. And because they do not know, they respond as a normal human being would. This is what creates the paradox. The more normal, healthy, and transparent the new supply is, the less they are able to meet the narcissist's deepest needs. Not because the new person lacks care, but because they were never unconsciously trained to function as a regulator. They do not anticipate emotions. They do not automatically absorb tension. They do not reshape themselves to maintain the rhythm. And from the narcissist's perspective, this is not interpreted as this person is different from me, but as this person makes me uncomfortable. Along Carl Jung's analytical axis, When the shadow is not contained, it seeks an external container. The new supply, in this case, cannot contain the shadow not because they refuse to, but because they do not possess the structural capacity to carry it. As a result, the instability does not disappear. It rebounds back onto the narcissist, and this is what they cannot tolerate. Not pain itself, but the loss of inner control. From this point on, the narcissist begins to feel that something is wrong with the new relationship, even though they cannot identify what that problem is. There is no clear wrongdoing, no conflict large enough to justify leaving. But one thing becomes increasingly evident. The new supply does not help them avoid emptiness. And within narcissistic psychology, anyone who does not help ward off emptiness becomes a threat. What must be emphasized is this. The narcissist does not realize that they are demanding an impossible function. They are not aware that they are asking a new person to replace an old structure that was built over time through dependency, fusion, and psychological entanglement. And so, when the new relationship does not work, they do not adjust their expectations. They eliminate the object, not as a strategic choice, but as a reflex to cut off the feeling of instability. At this stage, discard occurs without the need for a climax. It can be very cold, very fast, and even appear entirely reasonable on the surface. The narcissist may say, "It's not the right time, the energy doesn't match," or "there's no real connection." But behind these words lies a more stripped-down truth. The new supply cannot provide the unconscious familiarity the narcissist needs in order to survive in a state of non-self-regulation. And this is the crucial point. The new supply often does not understand why they were discarded, because they did nothing wrong. They simply could not perform a role they were never informed they were playing. They entered the relationship as an autonomous individual, but were removed as though they had failed at a task they never knew they were assigned. At the deepest level, this cycle does not speak to the lack of worth of the new supply, but exposes the structural limitations of the narcissist. Unable to tolerate difference, unable to remain with unregulated inner states, and unable to face their own emptiness, they are compelled to keep searching. Yet each search carries the same unconscious demand and therefore the same outcome. At this point, the picture becomes clear in a way that is no longer comfortable. The narcissist does not discard because they understand what went wrong, but because they cannot remain long enough to understand. Each departure is an act of avoiding the moment when they would have to face their own primitive void. And because that void does not disappear when the person changes, the cycle can only continue faster, shallower, and increasingly unconvincing even to themselves. In Carl Jung's language, this is not the tragedy of a single relationship, but the limitation of a structure that has never learned how to carry itself. When the persona no longer has sufficient energy to shield, when the shadow is not integrated but merely projected, discard becomes the most familiar reflex to cut interference, not to heal, but to survive. Each new supply is therefore expected to carry an invisible role, and when that role is not carried, they are eliminated without any explanation that reaches the core. What matters is to look directly at the consequence. Discard does not close the story, it exposes the structure. It reveals a system that cannot stop to learn, cannot slow down to endure, cannot remain still long enough to self-regulate. There is no more suitable person to resolve this problem. There is only confrontation, the very thing the structure perpetually avoids. When confrontation does not occur, replacement becomes strategy. And when replacement fails, discard becomes a temporary escape. For the observer, this truth may feel cold but liberating. There is no need to search for further causes in the person who was left behind, nor to wait for a day when they will finally understand. The cycle will continue until the structure is forced to change the way it operates, either through a crisis severe enough or through a therapeutic process that is long enough and genuine enough. Before that threshold, all explanations remain surface language. And this is the most important closing point. When you understand discard as a symptom of a system incapable of self-regulation, the story no longer revolves around personal fault or human worth. It becomes a map showing where the cycle originates, why it repeats, and why stepping out of the functional role is the only way not to be pulled back in. There is no winning or losing here. There is only the truth. Not every structure has the capacity to stop, but you have the capacity to see it and not enter it again.